The first thing Sophie Lane heard was the crystal glass breaking. It shattered against marble with a sound so sharp that the entire casino seemed to inhale at once. Champagne sprayed across the black lapel of Viktor Sokolov's tailored suit, ran down the front of his white shirt, and dripped slowly from the silver watch on his wrist. For one frozen second, no one moved. The roulette wheel spun behind him. Somewhere near the baccarat tables, a woman gasped into her diamonds. A dealer's hand hovered over a stack of chips worth more than Sophie's yearly salary. The music from the hidden ceiling speakers kept playing, elegant and cruel, as if it had no idea that a waitress had just spilled champagne on one of the most feared men in Europe. Sophie knew his name before anyone said it. Everyone did. Viktor Sokolov. Billionaire, private banker, arms investor, hotel owner, shipping magnate. The kind of man newspapers photographed from a distance and governments pretended not to know too well. The kind of man who arrived with 6 black cars, never waited for an elevator, and made politicians lower their eyes when he entered a room. And Sophie had just drenched him in champagne. Her tray trembled in her hands, not because she was careless, because a drunk guest had grabbed her wrist as she passed, laughing as if her body were part of the casino service. She had jerked away, the tray had tilted, and fate had chosen the worst possible man in Monaco. Viktor looked down at his ruined suit. Then he looked at her. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse. His face was carved from winter. Dark hair combed back, jaw shadowed with stubble, pale gray eyes so cold they seemed almost colorless under the chandelier light. On his neck, just above his collar, the edge of an old tattoo disappeared beneath the silk. His hands were still, but the men behind him were not. 3 of them moved closer. Sophie felt the circle form before she saw it. Tall men in black suits, earpieces, empty expressions. The kind of men who did not ask twice. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "A guest grabbed me. I didn't." Viktor lifted one hand. Silence fell harder. His gaze moved to the champagne stain, then to her uniform, then to the red mark already forming on her wrist where the guest had squeezed her. "You work here," he said. His voice was quiet, accented, controlled, not loud enough to carry. Yet somehow everyone heard it. "Yes. Then learn to stand still when men touch you." The words landed with more violence than a slap. Sophie forgot the bodyguards, forgot the cameras, forgot that she was in Monaco on an expired dream, with rent overdue and a passport locked in the employee office until her contract ended. She forgot that this job was the only thing keeping her from going home to Ohio defeated, broke, and ashamed. She only remembered every man who had ever mistaken her silence for permission. Her hand moved before fear could stop it. The slap cracked across Viktor Sokolov's face. Gasps erupted around the room. A chip stack collapsed. Someone dropped a cigarette holder. The drunk man who had grabbed her wrist stumbled back as if she had struck him too. Viktor's head turned slightly from the impact. His men reached for their jackets. Sophie stood still, breath shaking, palm burning, her whole body screaming at her to run. But she did not run. She looked straight into Viktor's eyes and said, "I'm not furniture. I'm not entertainment, and I don't stand still for any man." For 3 heartbeats, she was certain she had just ended her life. Then Viktor slowly turned his face back toward her. A faint red mark darkened along his cheekbone. His eyes did not soften. They sharpened. "What is your name?" he asked. Sophie swallowed. Around them, the casino held its breath. "Sophie Lane." Viktor studied her as if the name had cut him somewhere private. Then he turned his eyes toward the drunk guest still standing nearby. "Who touched her?" The man laughed nervously. "Come on, Viktor. It was an accident." The girl got emotional. Viktor did not look amused. His bodyguard moved once, fast, clean. The drunk man was seized by both arms and pulled backward so quickly his shoes scraped across the marble. Sophie's stomach dropped. "Wait!" Viktor looked at her again. "You defend yourself from me, but you defend him? I don't want anyone killed because of me." For the first time, something like curiosity moved through his expression. "No," he said softly, "not because of you." He stepped closer. Sophie forced herself not to move back. He smelled faintly of champagne now, and expensive cologne, and something darker, like rain on stone. The room blurred around him. His presence had gravity. It pulled attention, fear, obedience. He leaned just close enough that only she could hear. "When I punish a man," he said, "it is because of what he is." Then he walked past her, champagne dripping from his sleeve, and the casino slowly began breathing again. Sophie thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. By sunrise, Viktor Sokolov owned the casino. The news broke through Monaco before the sun fully touched the harbor. By 7 in the morning, every employee at the Royal Étoile had been summoned to the main gaming floor. The chandeliers still glittered above them. The tables had been cleared. The red carpet smelled faintly of smoke, spilled liquor, and fear. Sophie stood near the back in her black waitress dress, her wrist hidden beneath her sleeve. Nobody stood beside her. They had all seen what she had done. Some looked at her with pity, others with resentment. Most looked at her as if she were already a ghost. Armand Devereaux, the casino's owner, or former owner apparently, stood beneath the central chandelier with a pale, waxy expression. He was a polished man in his 50s, silver-haired, perfectly dressed, with the smiling cruelty of someone who had never had to apologize to anyone beneath him. Sophie had always hated the way he looked at the younger waitresses, like inventory. Beside him stood Viktor Sokolov. His ruined suit was gone. He wore black now, immaculate, severe, with a dark coat resting over his shoulders. The mark from Sophie's slap had faded, but not disappeared. Somehow that made it worse. Every employee had noticed it. No one dared look too long. Armand cleared his throat. "As of this morning, the Royal Étoile Casino is under new ownership. Mr. Sokolov has acquired controlling interest in all gaming, hospitality, and private membership operations." A murmur passed through the employees. Sophie felt her pulse in her throat. Victor's eyes moved across the room. When they found her, they stopped. "Every employee contract will be reviewed," Armand continued, voice tight. "Until further notice, all staff will cooperate with transition security." Sophie's supervisor, Nadine, leaned close enough to whisper, "You're dead." Sophie did not answer. Victor stepped forward. Armand stopped speaking. That small detail chilled her more than anything. A man like Armand did not yield a room unless the person beside him owned more than the building. Victor's voice was calm. "No staff member will be touched by a guest. No staff member will enter a private room alone. No staff member's passport, phone, or personal documents will be held by management for any reason." A wave of shock moved through the room. Sophie's head lifted. Across the floor, several women exchanged frightened glances. Not relieved, frightened, as if he had said something that was never meant to be said aloud. Armand's smile flickered. Of course. Naturally, these are standard protections. Victor did not look at him. If any guest lays hands on staff, he leaves through the back door and never returns. If any manager conceals it, he leaves with him. The silence grew thick. Then Victor said, "Sophie Lane." Her body went cold. Every head turned. She stepped forward because refusing would only make it worse. "Yes, you will remain after the meeting," Nadine whispered. "God help you." But Sophie did not want God in that moment. She wanted a locked door between herself and Viktor Sokolov. The meeting ended in whispers and hurried footsteps. Employees vanished into corridors. Armand lingered, speaking quietly with Victor near the roulette tables. His smile was smooth, but Sophie saw anger beneath it. Real anger, the kind powerful men kept hidden until they found a private place to use it. Victor dismissed him with one word. Armand walked away without looking at Sophie, and somehow that frightened her more. When they were alone, Victor turned. Sophie folded her arms, mostly to hide the shaking in her fingers. "If you're going to fire me," she said, "do it quickly. I did not buy a casino to fire a waitress. That makes you sound less stable, not more." One of his bodyguards looked at her sharply. Victor's mouth did not smile, but something near his eyes changed. "You are not afraid of consequences," he said. "I'm terrified of consequences. I just don't think fear is a good enough reason to let people treat me like dirt." He studied her again. He seemed to do that more than speak, as if words bored him but details did not. "Your wrist," he said. "It's fine. Show me." "No." The air tightened. His bodyguards went still. Sophie raised her chin. "You bought the building, not me." For a moment, she thought she had gone too far. Then Victor removed one black leather glove slowly, finger by finger, and placed it on the table beside him. "You think I want ownership of you? I think men like you always want ownership of something." That is true. At least he did not lie. He stepped closer. Sophie made herself stay still, but not of women who slap me in public. Her pulse betrayed her, quick and uneven. "Then what do you want?" Victor's gaze dropped to her hidden wrist again. "The truth." Sophie laughed once, humorless. "Men like you don't ask for the truth. You buy it. I bought the casino because the truth is buried inside it." That stopped her. The words hung between them like a door opening onto darkness. What truth? Victor looked toward the high corners of the room, where tiny black domes watched from the ceiling. "Tell me, Sophie Lane, how many cameras are in the employee quarters?" Her stomach turned. "There aren't supposed to be cameras there." "That is not what I asked." Sophie stared at him. A memory flashed through her. The faint red blink above the laundry room vent. The way Nadine had once snapped at a new girl for changing near the lockers. The locked hallway near the private suites. The girls who quit without saying goodbye. The one who cried in the staff bathroom and said, "If anyone asks, tell them I never went upstairs." Sophie's voice came out softer. "Why are you asking me that?" Victor's expression remained cold, but his eyes had become something else. "Because last night, after you slapped me, 3 men argued in a private room about whether you had seen too much." Sophie could not breathe. "What?" "One of them was Armand Devereaux." The casino seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Victor watched her reaction closely, as if pain itself could be evidence. "I didn't see anything," she whispered. "No," he said. "But they do not believe that." Sophie thought of the drunk guest grabbing her wrist. The spill, the slap, the whole casino turning toward her. A public scene, a spotlight, her name spoken aloud. She had not just embarrassed Victor Sokolov. She had made herself visible. Victor took something from inside his coat and placed it on the table. A black card, no logo, no name, just a strip of silver across the edge. "Have you seen this?" Every instinct told her to lie, but his eyes were too focused, too dangerous. "Yes," she said slowly. "Some guests carry them. They go through the east elevator. Staff isn't allowed past the velvet rope. What happens upstairs? Private gaming rooms. That's what they tell us. And what do you think?" Sophie's mouth went dry. "I think girls go up there smiling and come down looking like they've left part of themselves behind." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is the truth I bought. Why do you care?" The question came out harsher than she intended. For the first time, Victor looked away. Not long, just enough. "My sister disappeared from a casino in Prague 8 years ago," he said. "Same black card. Same private rooms, same kind of men." Sophie's anger faltered. "What happened to her?" Victor looked back. "She came home in a coffin, without a name on the report." The words were quiet, not emotional, not offered for pity. That made them worse. Sophie felt something cold move through her. "I'm sorry." "Do not be sorry," his voice hardened. "Be useful." There it was again. The cruelty. The wall. She stepped back. "I'm not one of your men. No. They obey because they fear me." His eyes locked on hers. "You disobey because you fear something else more. And what is that?" "Being powerless." She hated that he saw it. She hated even more that he was right. Sophie turned to leave. "Sophie." She stopped, but did not face him. "Until I know who saw you, who followed you, and who inside this building belongs to Devereaux, you do not go home alone." A laugh broke out of her before she could stop it. "You're not serious?" "Very. I'm not moving into some mafia cage because you bought my workplace." "No." Relief barely touched her before he continued. "You are moving into the penthouse." She turned around slowly. His face remained calm. Minefield calm. Gun before the shot calm. "You're insane," she said. "Possibly. I have a lease. Clothes, a life. You have a fifth-floor apartment with a broken street camera across from the service entrance, a landlord who accepts cash from Devereaux's security chief, and a lock that can be opened with a hotel keycard. Sophie went still. Victor's voice lowered. Yes, I checked. Fear and fury rose together. That's stalking. That is security. That is a word men use when they want their control to sound noble. He stepped closer, and for one brief second, the space between them felt less like danger and more like heat. I do not need noble words, he said. I need you alive. She should have hated the way he said it. Instead, it made her feel the depth of the room, the cameras in the ceiling, the locked doors upstairs, the invisible machinery of powerful men turning around her. I don't trust you, she whispered. Good. His eyes moved over her face with unbearable focus. Trust makes people careless. That night, Sophie did not go to the penthouse. She went home alone, because pride was sometimes louder than survival. Rain fell over Monaco in silver sheets, blurring the harbor lights and turning the streets into mirrors. Sophie walked fast, hood pulled up, one hand gripping pepper spray in her coat pocket. The casino's luxury faded behind her. Ahead, her apartment building leaned into a narrow side street above a bakery that smelled of butter every morning and damp stone every night. She told herself Victor had exaggerated. Men like him did that. They made danger sound inevitable, so obedience felt like intelligence. She reached her building door and froze. It was open, not wide, just enough. Her pulse slammed. The stairwell light flickered. Sophie backed away slowly. A hand closed over her mouth from behind. She fought instantly, elbow back, heel down, teeth ready. A voice spoke against her ear. Quiet, not Victor. She bit his palm. The man cursed. Sophie twisted, slipped on the wet pavement, and fell hard against the wall. Another figure stepped from the doorway. Two men, both in dark raincoats. Not casino security uniforms, not Victor's men. One grabbed her arm. Mr. Devereaux wants to ask you questions, Sophie screamed. The sound was swallowed by rain and thunder. Then headlights exploded at the end of the street. A black SUV turned the corner too fast, tires hissing across wet stone. It stopped inches from the curb. Doors opened before the engine died. Victor stepped out without an umbrella. The rain hit his black coat, his hair, his face. He moved with no urgency at all, and somehow that was terrifying. His men spread behind him like shadows. The man holding Sophie reached inside his coat. Victor shot him in the knee. The crack split the street. Sophie flinched so hard she hit the wall. The man collapsed, screaming. The second man froze. Victor looked at him. Run. The man ran. One of Victor's bodyguards followed. Victor walked to Sophie, lowered the gun, and looked at her bleeding lip. I told you not to go home alone. Sophie shook from cold, fear, anger, and the violent relief of seeing him. You shot him. Yes. In the street. Yes. You can't just... He touched you. The simplicity of it silenced her. Rain ran between them. The wounded man groaned on the pavement. Somewhere above, a curtain moved in a window and quickly closed. Victor reached toward her face. Sophie flinched. His hand stopped midair. For one suspended moment, she saw something break through his control. Not softness. Not yet. Something darker. Restraint with teeth. He lowered his hand. Get in the car. No. His eyes hardened. Sophie, you don't get to order me after shooting someone. I get to order you when men are trying to drag you through an open doorway. She laughed, but it came out broken. You think being right makes you less unbearable. No, he said. It only makes you alive. Another car turned at the end of the street. Victor's men moved instantly. He took Sophie by the wrist, not the bruised one, never that one, and guided her toward the SUV. His grip was firm but not painful, protective, not possessive. Yet everything about him suggested he was capable of becoming both. Inside the car, the leather smelled expensive and cold. Sophie sat rigidly, soaked hair clinging to her cheeks, while Victor slid in beside her. The SUV pulled away. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie said, If you say I told you so, I'll slap you again. Victor looked out the rain-streaked window. You may need both hands next time. Despite everything, a shocked laugh escaped her. It was small, unwanted, but Victor heard it. His eyes shifted toward her. The city lights moved across his face, revealing and hiding him in fragments. Sophie looked away first. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a private hotel above the harbor, a place so quiet it seemed removed from ordinary life. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked over the dark Mediterranean, where yachts floated like sleeping monsters beneath the rain. Security stood at every elevator. The furniture was expensive but not warm. Black marble, gray silk, art that looked stolen from churches and kings. Victor gave her a bedroom larger than her entire apartment. Sophie stood in the doorway, dripping onto a rug, probably worth more than her student loans. I can sleep on a couch. No, I'm not helpless. I know. The answer caught her off guard. He stood behind her, hands in his coat pockets, face unreadable. Then stop treating me like cargo. His eyes darkened. Cargo does not argue this much. She turned. Do you ever say anything normal? No. The corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. Then a woman entered with towels, clothes, and a small medical kit. She was in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a calm expression. This is Mila, Victor said. She is my housekeeper. She trusts no one, including me. So you may trust her. Mila gave Sophie a dry look. He is not wrong. Sophie almost smiled. After Mila cleaned the cut on Sophie's lip and wrapped her bruised wrist, she left a silk robe on the bed and disappeared with silent efficiency. Sophie changed in the bathroom with the door locked. When she came out, Victor was gone. But on the table near the window sat a file. Her name was written on the tab. Sophie should not have opened it. She did. Inside were photographs of her apartment building, her work schedule, a copy of her passport, her employment contract, records of money transfers to her landlord, notes about her mother's medical bills back in Ohio. A photograph of Sophie at 22, outside a Cleveland courthouse, after testifying against her former stepfather for assaulting her mother. Her throat tightened. Victor knew everything. At the back of the file was a casino employee list. Names circled in red. Several women marked missing. One name had been underlined twice. Emma Ruiz. Sophie's breath stopped. Emma had worked the private floor 3 months ago. 24 years old. From Miami. Funny. Nervous. Always humming when she polished glasses. Then one day, she was gone. Management said she quit. Nadine said not to ask questions. Behind Emma's name was one handwritten note. Child hidden? Sophie stared at it. A sound came from the doorway. Victor stood there. His eyes moved from the open file to her face. You read what is not yours. You investigated my whole life. Yes. The honesty infuriated her. She held up the page. What does this mean? Emma has a child? Victor entered slowly. A daughter, 4 years old. The child vanished 2 days after Emma did. Sophie's hand shook. No. Emma would have told me. Would you have been able to help? The question was cruel because the answer was obvious. Sophie looked back at the page. Is Emma alive? I don't know. Do you think she was taken upstairs? Yes. Sophie closed her eyes. The penthouse suddenly felt less like a prison and more like the edge of a battlefield she had been walking beside for months without seeing it. Why didn't you go to the police? Victor's face hardened. Because 3 police commissioners, 2 ministers, 1 judge, and a prince's cousin have black cards. Sophie went cold. Then no one is coming. No. His voice lowered. That is why I came. She hated that a part of her believed him, not trusted him. Not yet, but believed the shape of his rage. Why me? She asked. Victor looked at the window. Rain dragged silver lines down the glass. Because after you slapped me, Devereaux panicked. That doesn't answer my question. He looked at her again. Because when every person in that casino lowered their eyes, you raised your hand. Sophie's heart beat too hard. That doesn't make me special. No, he said. It makes you dangerous. The next morning, Victor put her in a red dress. Sophie stared at it, hanging from the wardrobe door, satin catching the pale morning light. It was elegant, expensive, and completely impossible. No. Victor sat at the breakfast table, reading messages on a phone that looked custom-made and probably illegal. You do not know what I am asking. You're asking me to wear that. Yes. No. He looked up. Sophie crossed her arms. I'm not your doll. You are not your mistress. No. Your hostage. His eyes held hers. Not unless you keep trying to die on principle. She ignored the heat that rose in her cheeks. Then what is the dress for? A lie. That got her attention. Victor set the phone down. Tonight, the Black Card members will attend a private auction at the casino. Devereaux believes I bought the Royale Etoile to join his network, not destroy it. I need him to believe you are under my control. Sophie's stomach turned. Under your control? As my fiancé. She stared at him. Then she laughed once. Absolutely not. Sophie, no. I slapped you less than 48 hours ago. It made us memorable. You're insane. You said that already. I'm saying it again because it keeps being true. Victor stood. The room changed when he stood. Space seemed to rearrange around him. If Devereaux thinks you are my frightened employee, he will try to take you. If he thinks you are my lover, he will try to use you. If he thinks you are my fiancé, he will invite us both upstairs to prove he is not afraid of me. And if he does, then I find the room. What room? Victor's face closed. The room where they keep the recordings. Sophie remembered the cameras. The employee quarters, the private suites. You think they have videos? I know they do. Her voice dropped. Of the women? Yes. And the clients? Yes. She understood then. Blackmail, control, a casino above the law, because half the law was trapped on film. Her anger began to burn hotter than fear. What happens after we find them? Victor's eyes turned almost silver. Then I burn their kingdom down. Sophie looked at the red dress again. It was not armor, but perhaps it could become a weapon. That evening, the Royale Etoile looked like nothing bad had ever happened there. The chandeliers burned gold. Champagne moved on silver trays. Women laughed under diamonds. Men in tuxedos smiled with predator teeth. Outside, rain misted against the windows, turning Monaco into a blur of harbor lights and black water. Sophie entered on Victor's arm. The red dress fit like it had been made from danger. Her hair was swept back. A diamond bracelet circled her wrist. Not jewelry, Victor had told her, but a panic transmitter. The ring on her finger was enormous, cold and fake. Victor wore black. Of course he did. His hand rested at the small of her back, light enough to deny ownership, firm enough to announce it. Every conversation stopped. Sophie felt the room recognize her. The waitress, the slap, the woman who should have vanished. Now she stood beside Victor Sokolov wearing his ring. Armand Devereaux approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Mademoiselle Lane, he said. What a transformation. Sophie smiled back. Ownership changes things. Victor's fingers pressed once against her back. Warning or approval, she could not tell. Armand's eyes moved to the ring. I did not realize congratulations were in order. Victor's voice was calm. Many things happen when men are not paying attention. The words landed like a blade laid gently on a table. Armand's smile sharpened. Then perhaps you and your bride-to-be will join us upstairs tonight. A private celebration for our most valued members. Sophie's skin chilled. Victor looked bored. Perhaps. Armand leaned closer to Sophie. You must be very brave, Miss Lane. She held his gaze. People keep saying that like it's an insult. His smile flickered. Victor's hand moved from her back to her waist. Possessive, public, controlled. Sophie hated how safely trapped she felt inside it. A man approached then, older, heavy-set, wearing a black card pin on his lapel. Sophie recognized him from the private elevator. He had once cornered Emma near the wine cellar and made her cry. His eyes traveled over Sophie. So, this is the little waitress, he said in French accented English. Careful, Victor, she looks like the kind who bites. Before Sophie could respond, Victor turned his head slowly. She does. The man laughed. Victor did not. And if you look at her mouth again, I will remove your eyes before dessert. The laughter died. Sophie's breath caught. The man stepped back, pale. Victor took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and handed it to Sophie without looking away from the man. To our engagement, he said. Sophie lifted the glass, fingers steady despite the storm inside her. To men learning where not to put their hands. For the second time in 2 nights, the casino went silent around her. And for the first time, Viktor Sokolov smiled. It was brief, dangerous, almost beautiful. Sophie looked away before it could reach something vulnerable in her. The invitation upstairs came at midnight. The east elevator opened only after Armand pressed his thumb to a hidden panel behind a velvet curtain. Inside, the walls were mirrored black, reflecting Sophie, Victor, and 3 other couples into endless, distorted versions of themselves. Victor stood close behind her, not touching now. That made it worse. The space between his chest and her bare back felt charged enough to ignite. "Do not drink anything upstairs," he murmured. "I know. If I tell you to leave, you leave." "No." His breath brushed near her ear. "Sophie." She looked at his reflection in the black mirror. "I'm not here to decorate your lie. I'm here because Emma and her daughter may still be somewhere in this nightmare." Something moved in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or fear. The elevator opened before he could answer. The private floor was nothing like the casino below. No flashing games, no laughter, no music except a low cello hum from hidden speakers. Dark velvet walls, gold doors. Men who looked too rich to be seen. Women too young to be there, smiling with empty eyes. Security at every corner, not to protect the women, Sophie realized, but to keep them contained. Her stomach twisted. Victor's hand found hers, not for the act, for control. Maybe his, maybe hers. Armand led them through a corridor lined with framed antique playing cards. "Tonight's auction is very exclusive," he said. "Art, favors, introductions, information. Our members value discretion above all." Sophie passed a half-open door and saw a woman sitting on a white sofa, staring at nothing, while a man spoke into her hair. She almost stopped. Victor's fingers tightened. Not yet. The words were unspoken, but she felt them. Armand opened a set of double doors. Inside was a private salon, where 20 black card members sat around a circular table. Screens lined one wall, currently dark. A locked glass case displayed passports, watches, phones, and jewelry in labeled compartments. Sophie's blood went cold. Trophies, or leverage. At the far end of the room stood Nadine. Sophie froze. Her supervisor wore a black silk dress instead of a staff uniform. Her makeup was perfect. Her face was expressionless. "Nadine?" Sophie whispered. Nadine did not look at her. Armand smiled. Every great theater needs someone backstage. The betrayal hit Sophie so hard she almost stepped back. Nadine had warned her. Comforted girls. Covered shifts when they cried. Told Sophie not to ask questions. And all this time, Victor's voice went flat. "You know her." "She trained me," Sophie said. Nadine finally looked at her. Something like shame flashed across her face and vanished. "I told you to leave things alone," Nadine said. "You told me Emma quit." Nadine's mouth tightened. Armand clapped softly. "Emotional reunions are tedious. Shall we begin?" One of Victor's men, posing as a server, moved near the wall. Sophie caught the signal. They were searching for the recordings. Then the screens turned on. At first, Sophie did not understand what she was seeing. A hallway, employee quarters, the laundry room, the locker area. Then her own face appeared on one screen. Sophie changing out of her uniform 2 weeks ago, visible through the gap near a vent. The room tilted. Victor moved so fast that 2 men reached for weapons. He grabbed Armand by the throat and slammed him against the table. Glasses exploded. Women screamed. The black card members pushed back in panic. Victor's gun was in his hand before anyone else cleared a holster. The cold mask was gone. In its place was something savage. "You recorded her?" Armand choked, but managed a smile. "You see? Even kings have weaknesses." Sophie stood frozen, humiliation crawling over her skin like fire ants. Not because of the image, because of the room, because men had watched, judged, kept, traded, because her body had been stolen by eyes she had never consented to. Victor pressed the gun beneath Armand's jaw. "Where are the files?" Armand smiled wider. "Everywhere." The lights went out. Gunfire cracked through the dark. Victor released Armand and moved toward Sophie, not away from danger, but through it. Someone screamed. Glass shattered. Red emergency lights flashed on, bathing the room in blood-colored pulses. Sophie dropped behind a table as bullets tore into the velvet wall behind her. Victor reached her and covered her with his body. His coat shielded her face from falling glass. His arm braced beside her head. She could feel his heartbeat, hard, controlled, alive. "Are you hit?" he asked. No. His eyes scanned her face, fierce and terrified for half a second before he buried it. "Stay behind me, Victor." A man rushed them from the side. Victor turned and fired once. The man fell. Sophie flinched, but Victor did not. His hand went to her waist, pulling her close as he moved them behind a marble column. His bodyguard shouted in Russian. The private floor erupted into chaos. Nadine appeared near the door, clutching a keycard. For 1 second, Sophie thought she was running away. Then Nadine threw the card across the floor toward Sophie. "The service stairs," she screamed. "Take them down." A bullet hit the wall beside her. Nadine staggered. Sophie cried out. Victor grabbed the keycard and pulled Sophie toward the corridor. "No," Sophie gasped. "Nadine." "She chose late," Victor said. "But she chose." They ran. Behind them, the salon burned with gunfire and red light. The service stairs smelled of dust, metal, and fear. Victor dragged Sophie down 2 flights, then stopped suddenly. Below them, voices echoed upward. Men waiting. He cursed softly in Russian. Sophie pressed against the wall, breathing hard. Victor looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain, not afraid of dying, afraid of failing. "There is another way," he said. "Where?" "Through the old vault level." "That sounds comforting." "It is not." He opened a hidden door with the keycard. Cold air rushed out. They entered a narrow passage behind the casino walls. Pipes ran overhead. The sound of the casino below was muffled, ghostly, like music from another life. Victor kept one hand on his gun and the other around Sophie's wrist. Still not the bruised one. Even now, he remembered. The realization nearly broke her. They reached the vault level, a long concrete corridor beneath the casino. Emergency lights flickered. At the end stood a steel door with a keypad. Victor entered a code. Red light. Denied. His jaw tightened. Devereaux changed it. Voices sounded behind them. Sophie looked around wildly. "What now?" Victor faced the corridor, gun raised. "You stand behind me." "No. This is not the time. I'm tired of standing behind men while they decide whether I survive." He looked at her, furious. "This is not pride. This is bullets. And I can read numbers." She pointed to the keypad. 4 digits were worn more than the rest. A faint smear of white powder marked the edge of 2 keys. "I worked service. People think waitresses don't see things. We see everything." Victor stared at her for half a second. Then he stepped aside. "Hurry." Sophie tried combinations with shaking fingers. The voices came closer. 2749. Denied. 7294. Denied. Victor fired down the corridor. A man shouted and fell back. "Sophie, I know." She closed her eyes, thinking of Armand, his vanity, his obsession with the casino's history. The Royale Etoile had opened in 1927. He mentioned it constantly in staff training, as if he had founded it himself. 1927. Green light. The steel door unlocked. Victor looked at her with something like awe. Then he shoved the door open and pulled her inside. The vault room was not filled with money. It was filled with servers. Rows of black towers blinked blue in the dark, humming like a mechanical heart. Screens displayed file names, dates, room numbers, client initials, thousands of recordings, years of secrets. Sophie covered her mouth. Oh my God. Victor moved to the central terminal. This is it. He connected a device from inside his coat. Progress bars began filling. Sophie walked between the servers, sickened by the labels, girls' names, dates, amounts, buyers. Then she saw it. Emma Ruiz. Her hand moved before she could think. She opened the folder. A video loaded. Emma appeared on screen in the private corridor, carrying a tray. Nadine stood beside her, crying. Armand entered. There was no sound, but Sophie could read his anger. Emma clutched something to her chest. A small, pink hair clip. The video cut to another angle. Emma being pushed into a room. A man Sophie did not recognize. A black card member. Emma, fighting. Nadine turning away. Sophie's eyes blurred. Then a document opened beneath the file. Transfer. Child. Marseille safe property. Sophie's breath stopped. Victor. He turned. Emma's daughter is alive. Before he could answer, the vault door exploded inward. The blast threw Sophie off her feet. Smoke filled the room. Sparks rained from the servers. Victor hit the floor beside her, rolled, and fired into the smoke. Men poured in. Not Devereaux's casino security. Different men. Military posture. Black masks. No hesitation. Volkov, Victor snarled. Sophie did not understand the name until one of the masked men shouted in Russian. A Mafia war. Of course, because one nightmare was never enough. Victor grabbed Sophie and pulled her behind a server rack. They are not here for you, he said. That's a refreshing change. They are here for me. Less refreshing. Despite the chaos, his eyes cut to hers. Stay close. The server room became thunder. Bullets tore through metal. Sparks burst like fireflies. Victor moved with terrifying precision, firing only when he saw a target, using his body to block every angle to Sophie. But there were too many. One came around the rack behind them. Sophie grabbed a heavy server tool from the floor and swung with everything she had. It hit the man's wrist. His gun clattered away. Victor turned, seized him, and slammed him into the server rack with enough force to dent metal. Then he looked at Sophie. You see? She gasped. Useful. His expression was impossible. Pride, fury, fear. Never do that again. Say thank you. No. Another explosion rocked the room. The download reached 91%. Victor looked at the terminal, then at Sophie, then at the door. He made a decision she saw before he spoke. No, she said. His face went cold. Sophie, no. Don't you dare do that silent sacrifice thing. I need 3 minutes. You'll die. I have done worse. The sentence broke something open in her chest. She grabbed his coat. I'm not leaving you. His eyes flashed. You do not get to decide that. And you don't get to save me like I'm just another ghost you failed. He froze. The name he never said stood between them. His sister. For a moment, the gunfire seemed far away. Victor's voice dropped. You are not her. No, Sophie whispered. I'm here. I'm alive. And I'm choosing to stay. Something in him cracked, not softening, breaking. He took her face in one hand, thumb near the cut on her lip, not touching it. You should fear me, he said. I do. His eyes burned into hers. And I trust you anyway. The confession changed the air between them. Victor lowered his forehead almost to hers, stopping just before contact. His control trembled there, in that inch of space. Then the terminal beeped. Download complete. Victor pulled the drive free, grabbed Sophie's hand, and ran. They escaped through an underground tunnel that opened near the harbor, where rain and sea wind hit them like a second explosion. Sirens wailed somewhere behind them. Smoke rose from the casino's upper floors. Guests spilled into the street in diamonds and tuxedos, screaming into phones. Victor's men converged near the docks. One of them opened the back of an armored SUV. Sophie climbed in, shaking so hard her teeth nearly chattered. Victor got in after her. Then she saw the blood. It ran down his side, dark against his black shirt. "You're hit." "It is nothing." She pressed her hand to the wound. He hissed, "Liar." The SUV sped along the stormy coastline, Monaco's lights streaking past the windows. Sophie kept pressure on the wound. Victor watched her hands, then her face. He looked almost angry that she cared. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like I'm doing something dangerous." "You are. I'm stopping you from bleeding all over luxury leather." His mouth almost moved. Then his eyes sharpened with pain. Sophie pressed harder. "Where are we going?" "Safe house. I thought the penthouse was safe." "So did I." Comforting. He looked toward the front seat. "Marseille route?" His driver nodded. "So, helipad in 9 minutes." Sophie blinked. "Helipad?" Victor's gaze returned to her. "Emma's daughter is in Marseille. You're going now." "We are." "You're bleeding. The child may not have until morning." Sophie stared at him. This was the part she could not fit with the monster everyone feared. A monster did not buy a casino to protect a waitress. A monster did not bleed in the back of a car and still think of a missing child. A monster did not stop his hand when a woman flinched. Unless monsters were more complicated than fairy tales allowed. The helicopter lifted from a rooftop in violent rain. Sophie sat beside Victor while Mila, apparently also trained in field medicine, stitched his wound without asking permission. Victor did not make a sound. He looked out the window, jaw clenched, one hand resting near Sophie's knee but not touching. Below them, the Riviera became black water and scattered jewels. Sophie finally said, "Tell me about your sister." Victor's eyes stayed on the window. "No. Tell me anyway." A long silence. Then, "Her name was Anya." Sophie waited. She was 19, reckless, kind. She believed the world was better than it was, because I had made sure she never saw the worst of it. His voice remained steady, but Sophie heard the blade beneath it. She went to a private casino party in Prague with friends. By the time I found out where she was, she had been moved through 3 countries. Sophie's throat tightened. "I found the men who took her," he continued. "I found the buyers. I found the banker who washed the money. But I never found the man who built the system." "Devereaux?" "Part of it, not all." "Volkov?" Victor looked at her then. "Sergei Volkov was my father's enemy. Now he wants my ports, my routes, my death. He did not build the network, but he uses it. Devereaux sells secrets to him. Women, tapes, politicians. Everything is currency. And now we have the files. Yes, then we can expose them." His expression darkened. "Exposure is not enough. Victor, these men do not fear shame. They fear loss. Of money, of power, of blood, of legacy." Sophie studied him. "And what do you fear?" The question unsettled him. He looked away. "Nothing useful." "That's not an answer. It is the only one you get." But minutes later, when turbulence shook the helicopter and Sophie gripped the seat, Victor's hand covered hers. Warm, scarred, steady. He did not look at her. She did not pull away. Marseille at dawn smelled of salt, diesel, and secrets. The safe property was not a mansion. It was a shuttered orphanage near the old port, its stone walls stained by weather, its iron gate locked from the outside. Victor's men cut the chain. Sophie stepped through, with her heart pounding. Inside, the building was too quiet. Dusty classrooms, metal beds, toys lined neatly on shelves, as if staged for inspection. In the basement, they found a locked blue door. From behind it came a small sound, a child crying. Sophie ran. Victor broke the lock with a single kick. Inside, a little girl sat on a cot, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one missing eye. She had dark curls, tear-streaked cheeks, and Emma's mouth. Sophie dropped to her knees. "Lena?" The child shrank back. Sophie softened her voice. "My name is Sophie. I knew your mommy." The little girl's lip trembled. "Mommy said not to go with strangers." "She was right," Sophie whispered. "She was very right." Victor stood in the doorway, gun lowered, face unreadable. But Sophie saw his hand tighten around the weapon. Not from anger, from memory. Sophie looked back at Lena. "We're going to take you somewhere safe, I promise." Lena stared past her at Victor. "Is he bad?" Sophie looked at him too. Every simple answer felt like a lie. Finally, she said, "He is dangerous." Victor's eyes met hers. "But not to you," Sophie added. Something passed across his face then. Pain, maybe. Or gratitude so unfamiliar he did not know where to put it. They wrapped Lena in a coat and carried her out into the gray morning. At the gate, a woman stood waiting. Nadine. She was pale, one arm bandaged, eyes hollow. Victor's men raised guns. Sophie stepped in front of Lena. Victor's voice turned lethal. "You should have run farther." Nadine looked at Sophie, not him. "Emma is alive." The world stopped. Sophie's voice shook. "Where?" Nadine swallowed. "Devereaux moved her after she hid the child. He kept her alive because she knows the offshore accounts. There's a yacht leaving Monaco tonight. If it reaches international water, she disappears." Victor stepped closer, every inch of him murderously calm. "Why should I believe you?" Nadine's eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. "Because I am tired of hearing girls cry through walls." Sophie stared at her. "You helped them." Nadine flinched. "I helped some," she whispered. "Not enough." "Why?" The question hurt, because Sophie already knew there would be no clean answer. Nadine looked at Lena. "They had my son." Silence fell. Secret child. Not Emma's alone. Nadine's son. Hidden somewhere. Used as a chain. Sophie's anger faltered into something more complicated and more painful. "Where is he?" "Volkov has him." Victor's eyes sharpened. Nadine looked at him. "I can give you the yacht route, the client list, Devereaux's emergency accounts, everything. But I want my son back." Victor said nothing. Sophie turned to him. "We have to help her." His gaze cut to Sophie. "This is how traps are built. And this is how women stay trapped forever. Because no one believes them until they're useful." Nadine bowed her head. Victor looked at Sophie for a long moment. Then he said to Nadine, "If you lie, I will know." Nadine nodded. "If your information saves Emma, I will find your son." Sophie exhaled. Nadine looked as if her knees might give out. Victor turned away, already issuing orders. Men moved. Cars started. Phones appeared. The world bent around his command. Sophie stood holding Lena's hand, watching him become what he was made to be. Not gentle, not safe, but focused, lethal, and aimed for once at the right monsters. By nightfall, the scandal had begun. Files from the Royale Étoile appeared simultaneously in the inboxes of journalists, prosecutors, international agencies, and private enemies of every man on the black card list. Not the videos of the women. Sophie had insisted those be destroyed or sealed beyond public reach. Victor had agreed after one long, silent look. But the financial records, guest logs, offshore transfers, coded ledgers, and proof of official protection went out like fire. By 8 o'clock, 3 ministers resigned. By 9, Armand Devereaux was claiming illness from an undisclosed location. By 10, Monaco police announced an investigation they had clearly been forced to pretend they wanted. By 11, Victor stood beside Sophie on a foggy harbor pier, watching Devereaux's yacht prepare to leave. Black water slapped against the concrete. The yacht glowed white and gold, elegant as a sin. Men moved on deck, armed, nervous. Victor's men waited in the shadows behind cargo containers. Sophie wore a black coat over the red dress, because there had been no time for anything else. Lena was hidden with Mila at a secure location. Nadine sat in one of Victor's cars, ready to identify Devereaux's men. Sophie's heart hammered. "Emma is on that boat," she said. "We believe so. You always say things like that when you're trying not to promise. Promises are expensive." She looked at him. Victor's eyes stayed on the yacht. "But I keep them," he said. The words settled into her chest. Wind lifted Sophie's hair. Victor reached as if to tuck it back, then stopped. Always stopping. Always holding himself at the edge of tenderness like it was a cliff. Sophie turned toward him. "What happens after tonight?" His jaw tightened. You go into protection. Witness protection? Yes. With Lena? Emma? Nadine? If they survive. And you? A pause. I return to war. The answer hurt more than it should have. Sophie laughed softly, without humor. Of course. Victor finally looked at her. What did you expect? I don't know. Something less lonely. His expression changed. Behind them, a radio clicked. His men were ready, but Sophie could not stop now. You bought a casino because I slapped you. I bought it because it was rotten. You put me in a penthouse because you were in danger. You made me wear your ring to get upstairs. You flew across the coast bleeding because of a child you didn't know. His face hardened. What are you asking me? Her voice lowered. I'm asking if any of it was me. The fog moved around them, softening the harbor lights. Victor stepped closer. For once, he did not look calm. Yes, the word was barely more than breath. Sophie's heart stopped. His eyes held hers with brutal honesty. It became you before I knew how to stop it. She swallowed. And did you try? His gaze dropped to her mouth, then returned to her eyes. No, the world narrowed. Fog, water, danger. His face. He lifted his hand again, slowly this time, giving her every chance to move away. She did not. His fingers touched her cheek, not claiming, asking. The tenderness of it nearly undid her. Then gunfire erupted on the yacht. Victor's hand fell. His face became ice. Stay here. This time, Sophie did not argue. Because Emma was on that boat. Because Lena was waiting. Because Victor was already walking into fire. The harbor became a war zone in seconds. Victor's men moved from the shadows, silent until the first shot. Devereaux's guards fired from the deck. Glass shattered along the yacht's upper lounge. Searchlights swung wildly across fog and water. Sophie crouched behind a concrete barrier beside Nadine. Nadine gripped a pistol with shaking hands. I never fired one, she whispered. Let's hope you don't have to. A scream came from the yacht. A woman. Sophie's blood turned cold. Emma. She moved before Nadine could stop her. Sophie. Sophie ran along the pier, staying low as bullets cracked overhead. She knew it was stupid. She knew Victor would be furious. But the scream had cut through every calculation. At the gangway, a wounded guard grabbed her ankle. She kicked him hard and scrambled up onto the yacht. Inside, the luxury was obscene. White leather, gold fixtures, champagne on ice, blood on the floor. Sophie moved through a corridor, following another muffled cry. She found Emma in a locked cabin, with her wrists tied to a pipe. Emma looked thinner, bruised, alive. Sophie? The sound of her name and Emma's broken voice nearly shattered her. Sophie dropped beside her. Lena is safe. We found her. She's safe. Emma sobbed once, violently. Sophie sawed at the rope with a broken piece of glass. Footsteps thundered outside. Hurry, Emma whispered. I'm trying. The door opened. Armand Devereaux stood there holding a gun. His perfect hair was disheveled. His face, once polished and smug, was twisted with hatred. I should have fired you the first week, he said. Sophie froze. Emma whimpered. Armand stepped inside. Do you know how many years it took to build this? How many men trusted me with their secrets? Sophie kept herself between him and Emma. You mean how many women you sold? His eyes flashed. Poor girls always want to turn business into tragedy. Sophie's fear burned into rage. You're not a businessman. You're a coward with a guest list. He lifted the gun. Then Victor appeared behind him. No warning, no sound. He grabbed Armand's wrist and broke it. The gun hit the floor. Armand screamed. Victor slammed him into the wall so hard the mirror cracked behind his head. Sophie had seen Victor violent before. This was different. This was personal. Victor pressed his forearm to Armand's throat. Where is Volkov? Armand gasped, smiling through pain. Already gone. Victor leaned closer. Wrong answer. He has the boy. Armand choked. Nadine's son. He has your shipping codes. He has enough to start a war you cannot win. Victor's face did not change. But Sophie saw his eyes. War did not scare him. Loss did. Armand's gaze shifted to Sophie, hateful and delighted. You think he loves you? Men like Viktor Sokolov do not love. They acquire. They guard. They destroy what threatens their possessions. Ask him what happened to the last woman he failed to protect. Victor went still. Sophie looked at him. The room filled with the past. Armand laughed weakly. He has not told you all of it? How sweet. Victor's voice dropped to something deadly. Silence. But Sophie whispered, What does he mean? Armand smiled through blood. His sister was taken because of him. Victor struck him once. Armand collapsed, but the words had already landed. Sophie stared at Victor. His face was closed, but not fast enough. Truth had passed through it. Victor, he did not look at her. Get Emma out. Tell me. Not now. Yes, now. Gunfire continued somewhere above. Men shouted. The boat rocked beneath them. Victor turned on her, eyes blazing. My enemies took Anya to punish me. Is that what you wanted to hear? Sophie's breath caught. I was 28. Arrogant. I thought fear was enough to protect everyone with my name. Volkov could not reach me, so he reached her. The confession was raw and furious, dragged from him against his will. I burned half of Prague finding her. It did not matter. She died because she was near me. Sophie's anger dissolved into heartbreak. Victor looked away first. So yes, he said coldly. Armand is right. I guard. I acquire. I destroy. Love, if that is what you want to call it, has never saved anyone in my world. Sophie stepped closer. You think keeping people away would have saved her? His jaw tightened. You don't know. No, Sophie said. But I know this. Anya didn't die because she was loved by you. She died because men like them exist. Victor's eyes moved to hers. And if you use her death as proof that you should never love anyone again, then they are still taking from you. The words hit him harder than any bullet. For a second, he looked almost young, wounded beneath all that power. Then a shot rang out. Emma screamed. Sophie felt the impact before she understood it. Not in herself, in Victor. He jerked once, blood blooming near his shoulder. Armand, half conscious on the floor, had grabbed the fallen gun. Victor turned. Sophie moved first. She kicked the gun from Armand's hand and slammed her heel down on his broken wrist. He screamed. Victor stared at her. She grabbed the gun and pointed it at Armand with both hands shaking. I told you, she said, voice trembling. I don't stand still. Victor's expression shifted into something so fierce it stole her breath. Then his men flooded the room. The yacht was secured by midnight. Armand Devereaux was taken alive because Sophie asked Victor not to kill him in front of Emma. Victor listened, though every line of his body argued against mercy. Emma was carried off the yacht wrapped in Victor's coat. When she saw Lena at the safe house an hour later, the sound she made was not a cry. It was something deeper, a soul returning to its body. Sophie stood in the doorway, watching mother and daughter cling to each other, both sobbing, both alive. Nadine stood behind her, arms wrapped around herself. My son, she whispered. Victor, pale from blood loss and refusing to sit, spoke into a phone near the window. Russian, then French, then English. Names, routes, threats, money, war. Finally he hung up. Volkov took the boy to Paris, he said. My men found the transfer. Nadine covered her mouth. He is alive? Sophie asked. Yes. Nadine nearly collapsed. Victor looked at his lieutenant. Bring him home. The man nodded and left. Sophie stared at Victor. He had no reason to help Nadine beyond the deal. No reason to honor mercy in the middle of war. No reason except that Sophie had asked, and a child was missing. He caught her looking. What? Nothing. You are staring. You're bleeding through your bandage. That is not nothing. She walked to him and pressed her hand near the bandage, not hard enough to hurt. You need a doctor. I have one coming. You need to sit. No. Victor. His eyes lowered to hers. Everyone else in the room seemed to disappear. She saw exhaustion in him now, not weakness. The cost of never allowing weakness. You saved her, Sophie said. His expression hardened instinctively, as if praise were a trap. We all did. No. You could have walked away after you got the files. You didn't. He said nothing. You could have left me in that casino after I slapped you. His mouth tightened. No. Why? This time, he did not look away. Because the moment you struck me, every dead thing inside me woke up. Sophie's breath caught. Victor's voice lowered. I hated you for it. That's romantic. I am not romantic. No, she whispered. You're terrifying. His eyes searched her face. And yet you are still here. She stepped closer. Maybe I'm terrifying too. For a second, he almost smiled. Then the doctor arrived, and the moment vanished into stitches, commands, and the endless machinery of survival. By morning, the world knew the Royale Etoile was burning from the inside. Not physically. Victor had refused to burn the building, though Sophie suspected he wanted to. Instead, he burned the names, the accounts, the protection, the illusion. News channels showed footage of police entering the casino. Commentators whispered about trafficking, blackmail, foreign money, organized crime. Officials denied involvement while resigning in carefully worded statements. Black Card members fled private airports and were arrested on tarmacs. Some vanished before dawn. Armand Devereaux's empire became a public scandal. Viktor Sokolov's role remained unclear. That was deliberate. To the world, he was the mysterious buyer who had acquired the casino just before the raid. A ruthless businessman caught near corruption but not inside it. His lawyers moved faster than truth. His enemies called him a snake. His allies called him brilliant. Sophie called him impossible. 3 days later, she returned to the Royale Etoile. Not as a waitress, as a witness. The gaming floor was empty, sealed by investigators. White sheets covered the roulette tables. The chandeliers were dim. Without the music, the casino felt haunted. Sophie stood in the spot where she had slapped Victor. She remembered the champagne, the silence, the terror, the way his eyes had changed when she refused to lower hers. Victor stood beside her in a dark coat, his shoulder bandaged beneath his shirt. You should not be here, he said. You say that about everywhere I go. Because everywhere you go becomes dangerous. Maybe danger keeps following you. That is also true. She looked around the empty room. What will happen to this place? Victor's gaze moved over the covered tables. It will never be a casino again. Sophie turned to him. What will it be? A hotel. A public one. No private floors. No black cards. The employee quarters will be demolished. Her throat tightened. And upstairs. His face became unreadable. A foundation office. Legal support. Housing. Medical care. For women who need to disappear and live. Sophie stared at him. He looked uncomfortable beneath her silence. What? He asked. You already decided? Yes. When? The morning after you slapped me. Her heart twisted. Victor, he looked away. Do not make it sentimental. It is sentimental. It is strategy. It's both. His jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Sophie walked to the nearest table and touched the white sheet. I can't go back to who I was before this. No, I don't know who I am now. Victor watched her carefully. You are Sophie Lane. She laughed softly. That's not an answer. It is the only one that mattered to me. The words were quiet enough to hide inside the empty casino. But Sophie heard them. She turned. He stood beneath the chandelier, the most feared man she had ever known, looking at her as if her existence had become a wound he did not want healed. What happens to us? She asked. His face closed. There is no us. The words struck cleanly. Sophie went still. Victor's voice remained controlled. Volkov is alive. My enemies know your face. They know what you are to me. And what am I? He said nothing. She stepped closer. Say it. His eyes flashed. You want a confession in an empty casino. I want honesty. You want something safe from a man built out of violence. No. I want you to stop deciding what I can survive. His control cracked. I cannot bury you, the words echoed. There it was. Not rejection. Fear. Sophie's anger softened into something more dangerous. She moved closer until only a foot separated them. You don't get to bury me while I'm still standing. Victor's breathing changed. Sophie, no, you don't get to protect me by abandoning me. You don't get to call it noble because you're scared. And you don't get to make me feel something real and then disappear behind your war like it was all strategy. His eyes burned. It was never strategy with you. Then stop lying. For a moment, neither moved. Then Victor reached for her. This time, he did not stop. His hand slid to the back of her neck, careful and firm. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close with the restraint of a man fighting every instinct to take more than she offered. He lowered his forehead to hers. I am not gentle, he whispered. I know. I am not good. I know. If you stay near me, I will become worse for anyone who threatens you. Sophie's hand rose to his chest, over the place where his heart beat hard beneath black fabric. Then become better for me too. The request struck him silent. His eyes closed once, as if the words hurt. Then he kissed her. It was not soft at first. It was restrained for one trembling second, then desperate in the way only controlled men become desperate. Quiet, consuming, almost painful in its honesty. Sophie felt the cold of him, the heat beneath it, the years of grief and violence he had locked away, until her hand against his face had opened the door. She kissed him back, not because he was safe, because he was trying. Because when the whole world had watched her become a target, he had stood between her and every gun, every camera, every man who thought power meant permission. When he pulled back, his hand stayed at her neck. His voice was rough. I should still send you away. Yes, I will not. Good. His eyes darkened. You have no idea what you are agreeing to. Sophie smiled faintly. I slapped Viktor Sokolov in public. I think I understand consequences. For the first time, he laughed. It was quiet, brief, almost broken. But it was real. 2 weeks later, the Royale Etoile reopened its front doors without roulette wheels, velvet ropes, or private elevators. Reporters stood outside, beneath a bright Monaco morning. Former employees entered through the main entrance, not the service door. Emma held Lena's hand. Nadine stood beside her son, who had been rescued from Paris by men who never gave interviews and never appeared on camera. A new sign gleamed above the entrance. The Anya Foundation. Sophie stood inside the lobby, watching sunlight pour through windows that had once reflected only night. Victor stood behind her, far enough that no one would call it possession, close enough that she felt him before she turned. You named it after her, she said. Yes. Does that hurt? Every day. But you did it anyway. His gaze moved over the women entering the building, some afraid. Some hopeful, some carrying children, some carrying nothing but the clothes they had escaped in. Yes, he said, I did. A reporter called Sophie's name from outside. She had become a public figure by accident. The waitress who exposed the black card casino, the woman in the red dress. The woman rumored to be engaged to Viktor Sokolov. The woman no one could decide was a victim, heroine, lover, witness, or scandal. Maybe she was all of them. Maybe she was something else now. Victor looked at her hand. The fake engagement ring was gone. In its place was a simple ring of black diamond and white gold. Real this time. Not an announcement. Not a cage. A question he had asked privately, badly, in the middle of an argument about security protocols. Sophie had said yes, only after making him ask again without using the word protection. He still struggled with that. She loved him anyway. Outside, cameras flashed. Victor's hand brushed hers, hidden from the crowd. A small touch. A promise. Are you ready? He asked. Sophie looked through the open doors at the reporters. The sunlight. The city that had watched her humiliation become a war. Then she looked at Victor. The man everyone feared. The man who had bought a casino after she slapped him. The man who had mistaken obsession for control until love taught him the difference. No, she said. His mouth curved slightly. Good. She squeezed his hand once. Let's go anyway. Together, they stepped into the light. Behind them, the old casino no longer glittered like a trap. It breathed like a second chance. And above the harbor, as cameras flashed and the world shouted questions neither of them intended to answer, Viktor Sokolov leaned close to Sophie Lane and said quietly, "The next man who underestimates you will be my favorite mistake." Sophie smiled without looking at him. "Careful," she whispered. "I still have both hands." This time, Victor's laugh carried into the morning, and for the first time in years, it did not sound like something broken. It sounded like a beginning.